All right, welcome to Witchpolice Radio. For people who listen to the show regularly, I think one of the things that I try to do over the course of doing this podcast is to find music that has a local connection in all genres, as long as it's something that's interesting. I mean, whether I'm talking to a rapper, or a country singer, or a metal band, or a jazz artist, or a classical artist, whatever it is, as long as it's something that just seems kind of different or new or interesting, something that I haven't had a lot of experience talking about is always interesting too. So I think that the guest on this episode is someone who is doing something that covers some of the genres I'm familiar with, but definitely some areas that are kind of new to me and are interesting. But I think the best way to start this off is if you want to introduce yourself and just give a bit of background about who you are as an artist and what you do.
Okay, so my name is Adele Wilding. My stage name is Adele M Wilding. I'm a professional jazz singer and songwriter and composer, and I'm also a music educator as well.
And I think that like I've had a lot of jazz artists on the show over the years, but for me as a listener too, my interest in jazz typically stays with instrumental jazz. I haven't really ventured too much
Yeah,
into vocal jazz. And I know there's a whole universe of music out there in
yeah,
that kind of subgenre of jazz, but I don't know too much about vocal jazz. I've had a few singers on the show, but it's really kind of an alien universe to me, even within jazz. So
sure.
I find it very interesting. As a genre because it's something I haven't really touched much yet, and I do want to get into that with you. But
Mhm.
you do have some events coming up in the near future that I think are kind of what made me want to reach out to you and have you on the show. And I think that both of these things that you're doing, and we'll explain what they are, but they kind of cover this interesting crossroads of music and spirituality and the spiritual kind of background that a lot of music, especially jazz, kind of has
Mhm.
had throughout it, like an undercurrent of this, you know. And so I guess maybe let's start with the what you're doing with spirituals, the thing with the MCMA.
Yes,
That may be a good place to start. So if you want to give some background on what it is you're doing, and then we can sort of get into, what the significance is of it and why you've decided to focus on this.
absolutely. Um, well, I was approached by Dominique Billingshurst Shattuck, who's the outreach coordinator at the Manitoba Conservatory of Music and Arts. And she'd approached me last year about offering some courses through their outreach programs. And one of the things that came to my mind immediately was to tap into the roots of jazz and a lot of the popular music that we all have grown to love
Yeah.
over the decades. And for me, that was the spirituals. And we did offer a course privately to one of our private community groups with whom we work. And the course was very well received. It was a hit, if I may say so. I'm actually quoting Dominique's words. And I decided, with everything that's been going on in the world in the past 3 years, and some of us pivoting and diversifying, I know pivot is a big sort of a catch phrase or
A buzzword, yeah.
a buzzword. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. But it is true. And I wanted to do something a little bit different, having worked in the professional jazz genre for over 20 years. So it started with that. And I'm also going to be offering a spirituals workshop, which will take place at the MCMA.
Okay.
It's an in-person, hands-on vocal workshop. It runs 3 Thursdays in March, starting on the 9th. So March 9th, 16th, and 23rd, it will start at 7 p.m. And the idea of that is to get people singing spirituals. We're going to be working on our own arrangements of spirituals, and the emphasis will be on the aural, AURAL, and oral
Right.
tradition of learning spirituals, because of course that all emanates from the West African traditions of making music, or musicking, as the musicologist Christopher Small calls it.
Well, and I think that what you said earlier too about it being kind of the roots of a lot of popular music, like that's the kind of the
Yes,
bedrock for almost everything that's come since. I mean, it's
yes,
especially having that oral tradition. Eventually, through the centuries and decades, that's something that has been written down and eventually been recorded and converted and turned into all these different styles.
yes.
I guess from a very basic way of looking at it, what is a spiritual? How do you define what a spiritual is?
It was for the enslaved who were brought over to the North American shores, and to the Americas in general,
Right.
not just North America, but Central America, South America, the Caribbean, the West Indies. Um, that was their form of a hymn, for lack of a better term, because when you think about the conditions in which they were expected to thrive,
Yeah.
there was a lot of uh, I wouldn't say depression necessarily, but just despair and this tenacity of getting through these conditions in which they found themselves being very oppressed and being stripped of their culture, being stripped of their language, and needing something to hold on to get through those times. So they just started passing around songs, and it all started with field songs or field holler, as they call it. One person will sing and the others will answer back,
Yeah.
which falls into the category of call and response, which of course also emanates from the West African musical traditions. And then when they started imitating the English of their slaveholders, and then they started compiling lyrics, and again, it's that oral way of learning,
Hmm.
making up words, making them rhyme, internalizing them, verbalizing them by singing them, and then passing them around that community, the community of the enslaved. And of course, it's been passed down now over the centuries. So for them, the spiritual was the hymn in quotation marks. It was that um, catalyst for survival, for hope, uh, and for somehow escaping those conditions and finding the promised land. And of course, the promised land back then for many of them, and I'll try not to digress too much, but it was moving northwards to the northern cities of the United States and then eventually into Canada.
Right, right.
Yeah.
What do you think is the I guess doing this workshop, what do you think is the
Mhm.
benefit of artists now kind of reaching back into that history and approaching these types of this type of singing and this type of storytelling through song from a 21st century perspective?
Well, I think with everything that we've had to endure in the past 3 years on a global level,
Yeah,
with the global health crisis, that going back to the roots of things when things were simpler and everything just came straight from the heart and the soul without any manipulation of any kind of instruments, instrumentation, or technology, and tapping into something that comes from the heart and soul. We're tapping into our own spirituality and making ourselves more enriched human beings.
right.
And one of the things that we're going to be doing in the workshop in March is we're going to be focusing a lot on using the ear, the oral again, to learn these songs as opposed to very nicely arranged printed forms of spirituals. And that has its place. Obviously in choirs, a lot of choirs sing spiritual and everything is written down because that's part of the Western classical tradition.
Sure, yeah.
Singing from, writing things down and singing from paper. But we're going to be taking more of the oral approach to learning these spirituals and making them our own. And again, that's tapping into ourselves as individual and what we can put out individually with these songs, with this type of music.
And I guess that kind of is a reversal of the tradition a lot of people have learned music with for sometimes all their lives. They've learned exclusively off paper and off having it pre-written, and this is just kind of approaching something they already know how to do from a totally more organic sort of viewpoint.
Absolutely. And that's the key word actually, Sam, is organic. So we're going to be going about this organically. We're going to be manipulating the musical language organically, the lyrics, and providing our own harmonies as well too.
Okay,
A lot of people out there can harmonize and are very good at it. And the best way to learn harmony singing is through the choirs, especially church choirs, hymns, the way they've been structured and written. So there's going to be a lot of that. We're going to tap a little bit into improvisation, not to the extent that you would with a vocal
sure.
jazz workshop, but that's where it comes from. Again, everything stems back to the West African way of making music.
Yeah, it's crazy how many different styles of music have all come from that one source.
Absolutely. And it all originated from that African American folk tradition. Jazz, for instance, is the fusion of African American folk way of making music with European classical music, and those two merged together to form what we consider to be jazz today. And obviously jazz has different styles,
Sure, yeah.
and very sort of varying styles, like swing jazz as opposed to cool jazz, and the big bands, and the cool era with Miles Davis and his
Yeah.
contemporaries. So but it all really does stem back to that early merger between the two styles of music.
Well, I think that it also kind of well, I don't know if you would agree with me on this, but I think that any
Mm-hmm.
kind of music that has what people would consider to be soul to it. I mean, whether that's a
Yes,
folk song or actual R&B music or hip hop even or country, anything that has that kind of soulful vibe to it, and is
yes,
harkening back to that sort of song and that sort of centuries old traditions.
exactly. And I don't know if this is really sort of like opening up a Pandora's box, but if you think about even back to the classical times, when you have people like Schubert, who was turning out these popular songs just left, right, and center, that was their pop music in the day. And I suppose that
Sure.
was their form of soul music, if you will. Obviously, a different type of soul music, but we all sort of relate to whatever comes out of our culture. And sure enough, for the European way of making music, listening to Schubert's Lieder or Schumann's Lieder or the chanson of the French Impressionist composers. It all emanates from those cultures, and it's what we relate to. But as you've correctly pointed out, anything that has the soulful vibe, like the country and the rock and roll
Yeah.
and
Blues,
blues,
obviously, in a huge
yes,
way. Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. And that all obviously stems back to the African American tradition.
What do you think is the staying power of that stuff? I mean, it's so many centuries later now than when that
Yeah,
music would have originally formed, and
yes.
it's still with popular music of all forms today.
I think the staying power is the root of the lyrics and what those lyrics represented. I mean, I have a private student. When I first started teaching her back in September, I always have these little meet and greets with my new students. And she had said to me during our consultation, she says, I just love singing spirituals. And when she said that, I could just see the passion that was emanating from her as she said that. And I think too, if you look at the 1960s as well, too, like a lot of those singer-songwriters, Pete Seeger and Joan Baez
Sure.
and their contemporaries, they were writing their songs using melodies or variations of melodies from the spirituals, because they were actively involved in the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
They had their own following. So the only way they could get the message across to their followers was to find something that they felt was a powerful tool for doing that. And it was the spirituals.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And
And
then I guess you go a decade or so even further, and you have rock and roll artists in England and in America
yes.
borrowing
Yeah.
directly from the blues, which is itself borrowing from
Yes.
the spiritual. So yeah, it makes sense. It all follows.
Absolutely. And the Rolling Stones as well, too. My father and I were discussing this not too long ago. My father's born and bred English. Huh?
My dad too. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, cool.
yeah.
Yeah. And Dad said to me, well, he said, when the Rolling Stones first came out and they were asked where they were getting this unique sound from, who was your inspiration? And they said, Howling Wolf,
Yeah.
you know? And of course, there was the blues rock movement with the guitarists like the late great Jeff Beck now and Eric
Sure.
Clapton and Jimmy Page. And it was all emanating from across the pond from the great African American blues artists.
Yeah, and then that's
Yeah.
that's itself has morphed into all these different sounds over the years too. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah,
okay, I do want to get back into this in a minute, but you also have another event that's coming up even sooner, and that's
that's right.
your Jazz Vespers event. So can you tell me a bit about that, and how long have you been doing that for?
Okay, so there's a new Jazz Vesper series that I had the honor to inaugurate, and this was December 12th, so just shortly before Christmas. The Jazz Vespers series takes place at Crescent Fort Rouge United Church
Okay.
in Winnipeg, here in Winnipeg. And it's officiated by the Reverend Mark Whitehead, obviously the Reverend of that church. And we'd had early discussions. It was myself and local jazz pianists, Grant Simpson and Mark, all wanting something to inject a little bit more jazz into the local neighborhood.
Okay.
So Mark decided like he would like to offer a jazz vespers that was all approved and went through, and we inaugurated it with a Christmas theme in December. And then there were local jazz performers performing in January. And I'm returning with my same trio this month on February 12th at Crescent Fort Rouge United Church. And we're going to be performing a Black History Month tribute.
Okay.
So Mark will be providing spoken word from the scriptures, and we'll be punctuating his readings with jazz arrangements of some of my favorite spirituals.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And the private student that I mentioned earlier, her name is Donna Fillingham, and she will be making an appearance as well, and she will be performing one of her favorite spirituals too.
The idea of jazz in a church is interesting because I think that, like,
Yeah.
at various points in history, jazz has been seen as the devil's music.
I know.
During its kind of evolution, right? So
Yeah, and blues in particular, right?
totally, yeah, yeah. And yet,
Yeah.
jazz has very spiritual. I mean, something like John Coltrane, like "A Love Supreme," is one of the most
Yes,
spiritual records ever, right? And it's a jazz record. So,
absolutely.
what do you
Yes.
think is the connection there? Like, what is it about jazz and spirituality that works well, especially instrumentally?
Yes, I think, oh yes, and I'm a huge fan of instrumental jazz, and John Coltrane is one of my favorites. I think, in my opinion, it's the openness of the genre and the way it allows people to flourish, because in churches now there's this sense of flourishing and nurturing souls,
Okay,
and a lot of that can be done in a genre where you can improvise, and the improvisation is an extension of who you are, not just musically, but of you spiritually as well too.
sure, sure.
Because when we make music, we are tapping into the abstract, we're tapping into our hearts or souls, and the um, our own self-expression comes out that way. And
And
of
that goes back to
course,
the soul thing too, right? You're
yeah,
actually accessing your soul and putting it forward into the world. Yeah.
absolutely. And improvisation is spontaneous composition. I mean, I did a dissertation on this when I was doing my graduate studies in the United Kingdom,
Okay.
and that's what it is. It's spontaneous composition, which again is another extension of our beings. So I think it's that flourishing and the nurturing of our souls and being free that has creates that very special connection between the jazz genre and spirituality, the church.
Right.
Yeah.
Who would you say this event is for? I mean, because there's people out there. I mean, like me, for example, I'm not a religious person, but I love jazz.
No.
And I mean, like,
Yeah.
and you mentioned earlier too, getting more jazz in the community. I imagine
Yeah.
that's kind of the goal here, right? Just to get this music out there to a wider audience that maybe doesn't already appreciate it or does.
Well, we do have a lot, as you know, a lot of great artists in this community.
Sure.
You've interviewed them on your podcast. I think what we're looking for is something unique and regular. So, pardon me, the Jazz Vespers runs on a monthly basis. And one of the things that I'd suggested is that because so many venues have closed in the last few years because of the,
The
you
pandemic.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, the pandemic and the aftermath and the effects of the pandemic, that it would be nice to have something regular to go to again. And I think it's gradually coming back up in the city. I'm hearing rumblings from fellow jazz artists saying, oh, this place is going to start this and this place is going to start that. And Mark Whitehead, the Reverend Mark Mike Whitehead, sorry, he's a huge jazz fan. He's an absolute jazz aficionado. And that's what he wanted to see in
Okay.
his community that he has there. And it's a beautiful church. It's huge balcony,
Oh,
just
cool.
fantastic acoustic, beautiful grand piano. And it's for anybody to come and enjoy. Now, if you're not a religious person, I'm sure you can appreciate what Reverend Whitehead has to say, because he puts it in such a way that it's accessible to anybody.
Right.
And without it sounding like it's trying to indoctrinate anybody. And I'm not saying that's what happens in churches all the times, but anybody, I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody like yourself who doesn't consider themselves religious,
Sure.
but would love to come and hear the music.
Well, and I think that's
Yeah.
an interesting thing too, because as someone who, I was not raised with any kind of religion, but I do love spiritual music. There's a lot. I mean, more than anything, I listen to reggae and I listen to dancehall, and
Good.
like
Yeah.
my collection of Jamaican music is huge compared to everything else. And then there's jazz, and
Awesome.
there's I listen to country gospel, like I listen to all
Yeah.
kinds of stuff. And I think that there's something when it's done genuinely, there's something very earnest and truthful about people who are playing music with that kind of background. When they
Absolutely.
mean what they're saying, there's kind of an honesty to it, that you don't have to be a believer to appreciate and to kind of you know get what they're getting at.
Absolutely. And if I could just give an even deeper example of what
Sure.
goes on in a Jazz Vespers event, when we did the Christmas event for Mark Whitehead and his church, he was telling the story of Mary from her perspective, which I thought
Okay.
was rather unique. So all of the music that we performed pertained to Mary, like Mary, Did You Know?
Okay.
And the Virgin Mary had a baby boy. And of course, We Three Kings sort of tapped into that. And we also performed Bruce Cockburn's Shepherd. So basically, we're kind of delivering the message in a musical way. So you hear it spoken directly from the scriptures by the minister, and then the musicians are delivering it. It's kind of like a reinforcement of what's being said
Okay.
by the minister. Yeah.
So how do people find out more information about this, about both of these events you're doing? Because obviously, they're very different, but they are related.
Yeah. So there's two ways you can find out about the African American Spiritual Workshop. You can you can either email my outreach coordinator, Dominique Shattuck, at
Okay.
outreach@mcma.ca. So I'll say that again, outreach@mcma.ca. Or if you want the visual aspect, you can go to the Manitoba Conservatory of Music and Arts website, which is www.mcma.ca. And if you Google it, it'll just come up in the top
And I'll link to it in the
half
show
of.
notes so people can find it if they're been listening. So
Even better, even better. When you get to the website, if you go via the website, you scroll down to adult programs,
okay.
click on adult programs, and you'll see my headshot with the title African American Spiritual Workshop underneath, and you click that on.
Okay.
And then and that will take you through the registration process as well. And it's only $50 for the
Cool.
3 weeks.
That's pretty good for a 3 week program for
Yeah,
sure.
very good. And it's a great way to kick off spring as well, too.
And it's obviously timely with Black History Month as well. I mean, I know
Absolutely.
it's in March and it'll be ending, but it's
Yeah,
still the same time of year, and this is still part of the conversation that's happening around this month, right? I mean, it's a
absolutely.
lot of the subject matter that's being discussed. So yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. And about the Jazz Vespers, if you Google Crescent Fort Rouge United Church, right on the home page, if you scroll down, you'll actually see a poster for the Jazz
Okay.
Vespers. I can also send you a JPEG as well, too, if there's any way of like attaching that to the podcast. I'm not sure.
I don't know if I can, but I can probably share it on
No,
social media if I. But yeah,
sure.
I'll link to something on there, and people should be able to find it. I think yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely.
And just to mention too to the public, entry to the public is via donation.
Okay.
Okay. And we would love to see you. It starts at 7 o'clock. I think the doors open around 6:30. And this show will actually, the downbeat will be at 7 p.m. on Sunday, February 12th.
And then what's the best way for people to find out more about your music and everything that if someone maybe is hearing about you for the first time on the show, they want to kind of keep
Sure.
track of what you're doing with upcoming shows or workshops or things like that. What's the best way to sort of follow you online?
Okay, so the best way to access my music would be through Bandcamp.
Okay.
You just type in Adele M Wilding. I'm also on SoundCloud as well, but SoundCloud is a huge sort of mixture of everything that I've written and recorded over the years. But if you want to purchase any product,
Yeah.
then you go on to Bandcamp and just look for Adele M Wilding.
Cool.
And I also have a website too that's that's hosted by Bandzoogle, and that's under my Adele M Wilding moniker as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.